I'd probably describe, with all the experts on board, if this was a NASA space agency, I'd probably describe myself as being the astronaut. So here we go. As King Thames Estuary divers, my wife Carol, best friend Steve Medal was diving the Thames regularly most weekends, and it was a chance meeting with a professor in 2010 at an airport departure gate, which led us to be invited to become Historic England's licensees to the protected wreck of London. With a ship like this, who would not want to be the licensee of it? Its location. The location, as Mark James mentioned earlier, is on the edge of a main shipping lane. In fact, if you can see my cursor, the London is between a dive boat here and this inbound ship. Diving this site is certainly not for the faint-hearted. Here we have two inbound ships. The ship on the right is using the main channel and the ship on the left is using the secondary channel. Often when we're heading out to the site, we see a ship what looks like it's going to go over the top of the London. Indeed, they do. We don't frighten the pilot by putting the boat in the location of a wreck site until the ship's passed. And this is the average visibility of a Thames estuary, pretty poor at the best of times. A diving protocols for the divers out there. Due to its location, a strict protocol is followed. The dive boat is anchored up tide of a wreck, and we use the shot line. We use the anchor cable as a shot and distant lines to safely return back to the boat. The wreck is at 18 meters, which gives us an average hour's bottom time, which is approximately the same time as the maximum slack water time. Sadly, we restrict the number of divers due to the risk of entanglements with our distant lines. And we need a permit from the Port of London to dive in the estuary, and are extremely grateful for their kind assistance, as they often do slow the shipping down for us. This is how the wreck was portrayed in the media, but sadly it's certainly not like this. As Mark James mentioned earlier, there's actually two main parts of the wreckage, 400 meters apart, Site 2 and Site 1. On our very first dive of Site 1, we made an exciting discovery of iron cannons, possibly what Ruth mentioned earlier in the talk. A real surprise at the time to the archaeologists at the time, because London was recorded to only have bronze cannons. We later found archive evidence that the London received a special ballast from above Deptford from the possibly Tower of London with worn-out cannons for use of ballast. And interestingly, the crew aboard the barge at the time was pressed into the Navy. Our discovery led to an invitation to visit the site whilst Wessex Archaeology were conducting a site survey. And being a keen amateur archaeologist, I'd already started to map the site out for my own satisfaction. I think the archaeologists were surprised at my site plan, and Alice and James said at the time that I certainly needed to be upgraded my license from a visitor's license to a survey one. After spending a whole year of getting to know, or what we thought we got to know Site 1, we decided to dive on Site 2. Site 2 is more nearer the main channels. Our initial observations at Site 2 was a lot more artifact richer than Site 1. I think from my observation, Site 1 looked like it took the full impact of an explosion, because a lot of the artifacts on Site 2 was left in situ, quite intact. But on the second dive on Site 2, which showed Carol, I gave Carol a tour of site, and there's muskets, there's musket stocks, loads of leather shoes, and lots of other artefacts. Sadly, on the next dives, it seemed that all these vulnerable artefacts were being washed away. They either was out of their original positions or not there at all. And also, sadly, human remains were also observed. So this was no surprise, seeing as over 300 people, above 300 people died when the ship exploded. Knowing how historically important this site was, our concerns was raised to Historic England. Anyway, why should we be the only ones to see such wonderful artefacts before they're lost forever? This was no surprise that we was losing stuff of the wreck, because the dredgers were working so close to the wreckage, deepening the channel and making it wider for the world's largest container ship, so it would soon be entering the estuary. To make sure we was doing things right, to make a scientific case to prove this, we placed survey tags and baselines were placed down as reference points. They were a really great aid to help record the site in the blackness. When you, with this image here, you can see this white slate, what we take notes on. The actual camera picks things up far better than the human eye. And trust me, on this particular dive, the conditions were far worse than this. Sadly, these reference points, they didn't last too long down there either, proving how harsh the bottom conditions are. The tide really does, race along. And even getting down to the site, it takes all our efforts to pull ourselves down. Missed the slide. It was great news that Ellis and James of Historic England at the time came back to us, and with a really kind offer to conserve all our artefacts. So great training was provided by Wessex Archaeology and the Nautical Archaeological Society, just to make sure that we was doing things the best possible archaeological practice, enabling us to make recoveries. This work was kindly funded by Historic England. We did have a meeting with the museum, and there was talk, we was told there's talk around the town that where a bunch of amateurs was dabbling with a wreck, and we wanted to make sure, like for our own satisfaction, that we was doing things right anyway. And here's Carol recording an artefact before its recovery. With archaeology, everything's all about content. If you don't properly record something in, you might as well just call it salvage, because we can learn so much from the context of the artifacts, where they come from on the sites. Many fascinating artifacts were recovered. And careful consideration and planning takes place before any recoveries were made, so that the likes of Angela could receive the finds in the best possible condition. Here is part of a ship's cable. It became exposed, and we thought we was going to lose it. So I had to work out a way of actually recovering it so it come up in one piece. So I thought, if I've got some actually gutter in, placed it on either side of this ship's cable, band it together with rubber bands. That way, at least it would come up reasonably intact. What I discovered is when this rope, once it's been conserved, you can still actually smell the pitch tar. It was put on it to preserve it. I think that was over 350 years old, and you can still smell the pitch on it. It's a lovely smell, to be honest with you. Also, things like this complete keg. We even managed to recover the bung actually went in, which went into actually the filling hole of it. And really delicate items like this book cover, which Angela mentioned earlier, and the leather shoes, which still included the laces. I would say that being the first ones to see these things after 350 years, when they first come out the silk, they're absolutely fantastic. You can still see the leather grain, all the laminated leather made up the sole of the heel of the shoe. And like Angela said, this is a latchet style shoe. I managed while I was listening to Angela's talk, where she said like it was a team effort all round the whole project. Having specialist people like Angela on board, when she said about the beveled glass, it's a possible mirror, this would make sense because we did recover this intriguing find, which came out of an open chest where the mirror was recovered. Also, I'd recovered a complete shoe from this chest. This I'd to believe now, listening to what Angela said, with a mirror, you'd probably get a brush. This is what I think this would have been. So it's really nice to have specialists to, help us understand understand our finds from the wreck. So you can see how very well the finds are preserved when they come out of the silt, and it's being able to recover them at the right time. But not all artifacts at risk are recovered. If we find with archaeology, I always believe the best practice is leave everything in situ. We did come across this wooden box that contained 6 square bottles. This section of the site was having no scouring, so we thought the best thing is to leave it as long as possible until we thought it was risk, until we would recover it when we thought it would be too vulnerable. And we always, when we go down on the site, the first thing I do is go across the site and see what parts of what part of the wreck is being suffered from erosion. And in one particular area, I came across this shoe, what looked like it was vertical in the sand, this shoe sole. It was just started to appear out of the silt. So I thought I'd just keep monitoring it before it got washed away. I thought it might as well leave it there. And after a few dives, half of it was exposed, so I thought now's the time to recover it. Only on its recovery, I did see on the bottom it said size 8, a size 8 shoe, which obviously wasn't from the London period. It was a much later recovery. This is one of my favourite recoveries, a small sundial compass. Would have been, to me, I would have thought this would have been a Rolex watch of a time as valuable as what a Rolex watch would be. But my real quest for the project to work out what was left of the wreck, as very little was known. No disrespect to Wessex Archaeology, what had been working the site previously, because of the limited time they had the site, reading their report, you could tell that they didn't really understand what was left of it. And talking to Nigel Naylin, the professor who we met at the airport departure gate, he said he could never get his head around this wreck. It was in too bad a visibility to actually really work out. And even another archaeologist we took out on the site, he was slightly frustrated on the way back in. He was like, having a little bit of a wobbly because he just could not understand the wreck. It was too much of a mess. It was too all over the place. But with the Thames, with a limited time, you do need a lot of dives to actually start to understand the wreck. And observing the barrels, galley bricks, and other features of the wreckage, and aided by backroom tours of the Vasa and the Mary Rose museums. Here's a picture of a Vasa. It's a contemporary period ship to the London. And we had a fantastic tour by Fred Hocker on the annual Nautical Archaeology's annual trip, where you actually go inside. And I was noticing things inside the vase of what I was seeing on London. So I'm starting to have a better understanding of what's actually left of London. And also we had a really kind offer of a guided tour by Chris Dobbs and Alex Hildred of the Mary Rose Museum. Showing me my site plan, they showed me their site plan from what they'd achieved out on the Mary Rose, and it was almost replica, almost replica of what I'd done on their site plan to what I'd done on London. And these trips were a real highlight in my voyage in the world of maritime archaeology. So with the help of my larger site plan that I'd created and the previous observation, I started to really have a better understanding of what remains of the wreckage. A test pit was requested to confirm my theory to historic England. I did believe it's just what seemed to be appearing from beneath the silt was looked like some decking, but this resulted me working with alongside Cotswold Archaeology, working alongside a professional archaeologist. Exciting times these were, because the trench that I was working in, where I wanted my test pit to be, I discovered the complete gun carriage and the ship's main gun decks. And being as rare as hen's teeth, the gun carriage was recovered. And here you can see it ashore. Like Kira mentioned in the previous talk, like, you know, it's coming back to, or it's come back to Southend. Yes, I'd love to see it. So all this confirms my hypotheses regarding Site 2, where Mark mentioned we've got the outer edge of the hull of a London. Here we have the gun decks. Here we had the gun carriages. And if you can look on this the sketch, here's the main gun deck. You've got the orlop deck, or in fact, the period of the London, they were raised platform. They didn't actually have an orlop deck at the time. And here, this side of the wreckage, I came across complete barrels. And interestingly, like Angela Middleton mentioned on her talk, there's a whole pile of shoes. Yes, that pile of shoes came from this area here, and they were neatly stacked all together, and it looks like the cloth bag or the hessian bag that contained them had actually rotted away. I'm not too sure if I can remember that Angela said there might have been remains of the actual bag that contained them. But the pile of shoes suggested that they were actually in the hold of a ship at the time, which would be in this area of the wreckage. So we had another really exciting discovery a few weeks later on one of our volunteers' dive. Knowing that I'd found the gun carriage, the first gun carriage and the gun deckings, I know that if I worked away along the gun decks, obviously I'm in luck. I was going to find another gun carriage, and this one was still in situ. It all had its gunner's implements still in situ. It had its rope and tackle, all its ramrods. The thing was, I did notice, like, about this site, it seemed like the whole of this area of the ship, when they were getting ready for battle, they use this part of the wreck to store everything, or to place everything on board at the time, because we've recovered so many linstocks. There's a whole box of musketeers gunpowder charges. There'd be too many gunners' implements just for one particular gun carriage, and because they all neatly stacked in a row, and some were piled on top of each other, these were in situ before the wreck exploded, if this makes sense. Sometimes on a dive, when the conditions are right, I feel I'm the luckiest person in the world to be diving this site. As sometimes in the Thames, you get really magical moment when the wreck reveals its secrets. It was a particular dive when you get for about 10 minutes on the top of the tide, everything goes perfectly still. The silt drops out of the water and there's absolutely no current. And there I am on the area where the main gun decks is. I'm going along. You've got this gun carriage there. Going further along the gun decks, which are absolutely pristine at the time. Looking out of the gun port, the area where the excavated gun carriage came out of. You've got all the gunner's implements still in position. Going further along the gun deck, and you're coming across the ship's cable. So there, if I was on the ship at the time, I would be going along this part, the main gun deck. Now, what a real privilege for me to be diving, to be able to dive on a 17th century wreck. But now with a much larger shipping activity coming into the Thames estuary, and on this particular dive, we actually felt like we was actually being pulled off the site. A container ship came past the site really close. It couldn't, apparently there was another outbound one, so they couldn't really give us the room what we normally get. And if in that video here, I could show you, sorry. This timber is actually a supporting pillar, what actually supports the main gun deck. We come across quite often. We come across timber fragments like this. Once they come out of the silt, we lose them forever. So more artefacts were still eroding from the silt, but a recovery license was withdrawn due to lack of funding, or like Angela said, we had to put a stop because we were still making further recoveries. But sadly, like Tide and Time, stuff was still coming out to wreck, and we're sadly watching it being washed away. So all we could do was record and monitor the wreck's deterioration. Where I mentioned we came across a second gun carriage, it had all the gunner's implements. Over a whole year's diving, we actually watched all the gun implements being eroded and eaten away, like this image on the right. This was a perfectly preserved gun carriage pulley block, but now there's absolutely nothing left of it. In fact, there's nothing left of the second gun carriage we discovered. All what's left of it was a stack of blank cannon aprons. These aprons were lead sheets were put over the touch hole of the cannon to keep the gunpowder dry. And obviously there's a whole stack of them. What was at the time was actually placed on the gun carriage bed between the gun carriage and the cannon at the time. That's another reason why I think a lot of things were actually being stored on this side of the ship. Possibly because, as mentioned earlier, there's wives and girlfriends on the ship at the time. I would imagine once they'd have departed the ship and the ship was on the way down the estuary, all the gunner's implements would have been actually placed to their relevant gun carriage and cannons at the time, ready for use for the warfare. We knew how much the marine boring critters were having an effect on the wreck, because previously we replaced some wooden samples out on the wreck site for a university student for her studies. These consisted of pine blocks, elm blocks and oak blocks to see how quickly they deteriorated. And here we have cannon tampion reel. This reel would, each individual piece, the segments of this tampion reel would have been broken off by the gunner and actually placed in the muzzle of the cannon to actually keep the cannon bore dry. This side of it was actually in the silt, and this is what the effects of when it comes out exposed from the silt. You can actually see how the gribble affects the artifacts at the time. A real surprising discovery was made out on Site 1 in 2019. Diving a 17th century warship, we expect to find ordnance, but not of this type. How many times must we have gone over this this thing without actually knowing it? This because actually at the time of diving the whole, as mentioned earlier, diving the whole Site 1 for a whole year, we'd gone over the area and it was completely sanded over, silted over. So this actually proves that Site 1 is having an effect as well. The silt levels, well, the loss of silt levels also. And also this was confirmed by what Mark James said earlier. This turned out, if it wasn't for the Dutch trying to blow the London up in 1665, the Germans tried too, as a 1,000-kilogram magnetic parachute mine was discovered. And here it is. This is a lifting lug. I put my tape measure in it because out on the dive at the time, normally if I come across something really interesting, I come up to my dive buddy, Steve Middle, and tap him on the shoulder and take him to have a look, and vice versa. And as Steve tapped me, I thought, oh, good. I hope to find one of these iron cannons, what should be still out on the site. But no, he brought me to this. I knew exactly what it was at the time from one of my old naval books, that it was a German parachute mine. So I thought the best thing to do is, like any archaeology artifacts we find, is to record it as best I could and actually mark its position. So the Royal Navy Bomb Disposal Unit was called in to remove it. Interestingly, they stated that this was one of the most challenging places that they had ever dived. But we're really grateful for what they did. They actually moved the mine off the site to take it down to Ministry of Defence ranges further down the estuary and detonated it. So we're really grateful of what they've done. Otherwise, there certainly probably wouldn't be even more of a wreck left. But thanks to the Save a London campaign and the London Shipwreck Trust, we can now make a case to Historic England for further recoveries, providing we have enough funds to cover the costs of the conservation. This, according to the ordnance experts we have on board, this is a really rare find, a rare cannonball gauge. It actually measured the cannonball to make sure they fitted the cannons, the right cannons. It's no good in warfare, it's only putting a cannon, can't put the wrong size cannon in a cannon. So this was used to actually take measurements of a cannon for the correct cannon. And like Mark said previously, last year I came across this exciting little find, a rare quarter-size shaft and globe bottle, as apparently there's only, including this one, only 3 others in existence. And here we have a seal on it. This seal wasn't a maker's mark. Reading Samuel Pepys' diary, that he felt really privileged that in a tavern he received a wine bottle with his own seal on it. So wouldn't it be great if we could actually find the owner to this bottle? But listening to the early the talks, it might be hard, but who knows? It would be a nice thought anyway. And another last year's recovery. So we're learning new things all the time. Where Angela mentioned this is a latchet style shoe, my latest recovery turns out to be the latest fashion design at the time of the London sinking. It's more in the style of a boot. This is according to the Leather Shoe Museum. And many spin-off projects have been created from our recoveries, and some, I'm really proud to say, have even made their way to the National Maritime Museum. And a really big thanks to Southend Museum, as they are the receiving museum for our recoveries. When I was having discussions with Ellis and James about if we could recover stuff, I said, wouldn't it be nice if we could keep our stuff to the local museum? That way it won't be too far for me to go if I ever wanted to go and do more research on them, because that's, to me, that is the beauty about this site and archaeology. When you start to get to know the wreck, you know where to expect to find certain items. So if your house exploded 300 years ago, or if a house was suddenly exploded and it was untouched for 300 years, if you start working out the plans of a house, you know that obviously you're going to find, if you're working in the living room, if you're going into the living room, you're going to find a telly. And that's the same for the wreck. So we've got some really exciting plans for this year's dive season and beyond. One is, like, as Wizard Mark James explained earlier, it's absolutely fantastic of what he does. Here's some really great sonar images of the site. But one thing, you can have all the best sonar images in the world, but what they don't really tell you is actually where all the little artifacts come from. And here's another one he produced. I really felt proud when I actually scaled my actual site plan down. It actually did overlap on this sonar image. I just thought it was quite good, really. But the thing is, really poor visibility, it's hard to take measurements and to know exactly where we are. We know where we exactly are on the wreck, but we don't actually know the actual GPS positions. So with great funding from Historic England this year, I've been told I'm going to have a little electronic tracking device placed on me, and I'll be able to go around the site and say where I'm at. And with Mark James on the surface, he can actually click and we can actually place exactly where I am. This will really help me produce a much better site plan than I can ever achieve by doing it on my own. And also it will help us to get a much better understanding of a wreck. Also, sorry, going back to what Mark James said earlier about the silt erosion. Yes, it's fantastic that he can actually see it on the surveys, and to back, like he said, we can actually back him up to actually say where out on the site where actually the wreck's suffering from erosion. And under this bit here where there's a scale, this is where I found that complete shoe that I recovered last year. And also, Mark mentioned that we had silt lots here. Yes, definitely, I can actually vouch for that, because here you've got the main gun deck, and over the course of weeks on a dive, you actually see the silt level dropping. In fact, our observations that the silt is dropping into the main channel. And this is brilliant for me because I don't need an excavation license. The tide's doing it for me all the time. And in this particular part of the wreck, I was coming across bundles of firewood what was stacked below your lot deck. And also, where we're having observations of galley bricks on this part of the wreck, we also, on site one last year, I also came across a fragment of the ship's furnace, which was used as a cooker for the ship. So you've got galley bricks on site 2, and the copper furnace on site 1. So obviously these two parts of the wreck, these two actually associated. So it'd be really great. I can't wait to do more research to actually find a way of connecting these two parts of the wreckage together. And making a case for recovering a record. I've had so many meetings in the past with Historic England. Because the wreck, we're always seeing stuff being washed away on the wreck. My argument was, surely it's better to recover the stuff, record it, and even if you want to throw it away, at least we've got a record of it, than nothing at all. But Historic England being sympathetic, so it's having sympathy on us, we actually produced a record recovery and repair feasibility study was conducted to actually see if it's practical, if we can actually recover stuff, record and rebury it. So what we could learn from this fascinating site if the study was fully implemented. Here is one of the gun deck planks, what I discovered. It's got all these intriguing markings on them, but sadly these are lost forever. If only we could have recovered it, recorded it, at least we might have a better understanding of whether it was one of the sites, it was a game one of the sailors played on board, or whether it was a builder's marks. Especially with the likes of some really great leading specialists like Richard Enzer and Frank Fox on board. With me being able to measure the structure of the wreck, Richard, being an expert he is, can actually tell us exactly where they were placed on the site. And also Richard and Jim Davis and Frank Fox has also very kindly offered to produce a book, a coffee table reading book, regarding the London and our experiences out on the site, with all the proceeds going to the support the London Shipwreck Trust. But none of this would have happened if it wasn't for our great support provided by our nominated archaeologist, Mark Beattie, and the Nautical Archaeology Society. I especially felt really privileged last year as I was being made a fellow of a society. And we're also extremely grateful to the Nautical Archaeology and the Save the London campaign in helping to support our diving expenses. And to all the supporters like yourself who are tuned in today, and many others that has helped the cause, I'd really like to say a really big thank you to all of you. So thank you.
Thank you, Steve. The diver tracking. So the idea, for just to give kind of everybody an idea, is that you'll be underwater. You'll have this gizmo attached to you, which will plot where you are, and presumably you will, via communications to the surface, tell them what you're looking at and where you think you are on the site.
Yes, yeah, definitely, because we could correlate that to actually a site plan. I've taken on some of the sonar images. I've gone down and I've measured some of the beams, and they don't actually work to the true measurements. And talking to Mark, and he said no, they never will do. But I'm sure with his technology now, we can actually do that to produce an actually accurate site plan.
Yeah, I certainly think that the disconnect at the moment is we've got good geophysics and we've got a good site plan. It's joining the two together in such a way that other people can understand what you understand about where, as you said, you can't really tell the nitty gritty, the details from the multi-beam or the side scan, no matter how good it is. You need the diver in the water making the observations, and it's not just an opinion, it's fact. That is where you were. It's not your opinion about where you were, it's categorical.
Exactly. One thing, and with one thing, like I mentioned that we haven't got to excavate the wreck. When we was excavating the wreck, loads of duplicate artifacts came out at the same time. Most of all the really exciting, I think the most exciting discoveries came off from actually surface exposed. And one archaeologist said to me, could I not be so bloody particular about placing a shot? Could I just put it somewhere else on the site? So at least he could see all the stuff we see at the weekends rather than just the bloody gun carriage area. So, it just shows that you do get to know the wreck, and it's just a fantastic site.
I completely agree. You have to be in the water to know your way around. You can't expect on one dive, or in my instance, I can't expect on whatever 10 dives to know where I'm going yet. It takes time to get your bearings when you're working in effectively thick fog. Where do you go? How do you navigate your way around? So as your dive buddy on occasions, I'm very grateful to the hand holding and the line laying that takes place to show us around. There's been certainly lots of lovely comments. Thank you, Steve, for your presentation. Brilliant work as ever. You're a real inspiration to us all. Look at that. Oh, There's a lot of love out there for you today, Steve, from people in the audience. So just to update people, as Steve mentioned, the work going on. So the diver tracking, hopefully with MSDS Marine, will take place some point during the course of the year, during the summers. Hopefully we're allowed to get together and work together. The record, recover, rebury idea, the feasibility study has been submitted and approved by Historic England. And the idea is to now produce a project design for a pilot study to demonstrate that we can safely recover loose timbers, not articulated timbers, but loose timbers from the site, recover them safely, record them, document them in detail, and then replace them somewhere safe, potentially for future recovery and conservation. So not necessarily back out onto site again to be lost, but actually so that perhaps in 5 years, 10 years, however long, we'll actually be able to recover them and have them conserved for future study and analysis. Okay, so that's brilliant, Steve. Thank you so much for finishing us off for today.